Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Noelle, and in this video I would like to share my process for my sunset seascape fairy painting. I painted the subject 3 times and recorded my process for 2 of them, so I thought it would be cool to compare my processes for both pieces instead of just the final one. For each piece, I will reflect on my experiences while painting them and share what I have learned. Of the 3 pieces, the first one I made was a small practice piece, and I do this often before attempting a larger piece. I did not film the process for this one, but you will have plenty to see from the other 2. After I drew my light sketch and erased parts with my kneaded eraser, I began applying my masking fluid. At first, I thought that I would use a toothpick, but I quickly realized this would take way too long, and I moved on to using my ruling pen. I don't have the best control over my strokes with this pen compared to using a brush, but I didn't need that much control for this project. Once I was finished, I let the masking fluid dry completely before I proceeded. The layer of paint I started out with was for the sky, and in this step I painted with the warmer hues. The oranges went on first, and then I mixed in some red closest to the horizon and more Naples yellow above it, where it will eventually fade into blue sky. By having the watercolor block propped up at an angle, the paint will move in the direction of gravity or downward more and create a smoother wash. Once I was finished with the gradient, I grabbed a mostly dry brush with Naples yellow on it to bring out some lighter areas in the clouds. Right after this, I tried to soften the line at the horizon, but this caused the paint to bloom unexpectedly, and I just continued working. For the water, I started with an orangey color in the center around the sun reflections, and then in the same layer included my ultramarine blue and Prussian blue mixture. This is the first of 2 large washes I painted for this section, and I was mostly trying to figure out how to paint water where there are 2 distinct colors almost woven into each other. The waves didn't just have one spot that was yellow-orange and another that was blue. There were orange spots among blue areas and blue spots among orange areas. Back to the sky, I added another layer of clear water and began adding blue to the top of the sky gradient. I used a smaller brush this time, so I could have less water and paint on my brush for better control. I added a little more red-orange paint near the horizon where the blooms occurred, and used a purpley mix to paint the clouds. Because I wanted the paint to stay put, I removed the ankle lifts and proceeded to paint on a completely flat and horizontal surface. I tried my best to make the clouds as smooth as possible and began lifting paint for sun highlights with a drier brush. Returning to the water, I wet the surface again and basically did the same thing as the first layer, but a little darker. I struggled to get this wash to do what I wanted and ended up with some spots without enough paint and therefore too light in value. The lightest area in this section should be, by far, the reflections from the sun underneath the masking fluid. Because of this, I felt compelled to create a third piece when I saw how the shimmery water reflections appeared less striking in contrast to the rest of the water around it. At least, that's not what I had planned originally. This part was so satisfying to paint. When I was working on it, I excitedly started to see a glimpse of the final product. The dark lines added a lot of needed context for the piece, so now this section feels like water and waves. On the other hand, I also felt like something was lacking. My first two washes were not vibrant enough to compete with the dark waves, and now it appears way too light and washed out. This is where I began to actually consider creating an additional piece and what I would do differently for that one. Here I scrubbed the dried paint around the sun and dabbed it with a paper towel to make the sun look softer. As I was painting here, I realized that I should have added this layer before adding the wave details. I wanted the sun reflection to pop and for the foam to appear lighter, but it was a little too late for that. So now that the large chunks of the piece were finished, I moved on to adding the smaller details and touches around the sand, water, ferry, and sky. When I finished this piece, I wrote a list of elements that I wanted to change for the next piece. This included painting the ferry in a lighter value, painting the water with more orange and overall vibrancy, including more details in the waves, and trying a new approach for painting the clouds and the sand at the bottom. In the next piece, I did make these changes, but I also repeated some issues and created new ones. To be clear, I don't think this is a bad painting. My final piece strongly resembles this one, and it plays a vital and inevitable role in the learning process. I am being nitpicky. One of my favorite parts of this piece is how the sky turned out. I love the smooth gradient, the soft cloud, the distant mountains, and the birds. In the next half of this video, you will see how the final piece also had its own bumpy journey. Right off the bat, I have already made a mistake. I drew my sketch, applied masking fluid on the water, but I forgot to include the sun. Anyway, this time around, I added a couple more warm colors to my palette because I struggled to get the vibrancy that I wanted the first time. My palette was too limited with Naples Yellow, New Gamboge, and Pyrrole Red, so I added Quinacridone Gold and Azo Orange as well. The Azo Orange was especially important to make a nice orange without being too yellow. If I use too much yellow, I will end up with too much vibrant green after I apply blue later on, and I don't want this piece to have a lot of green. A little green in a sunset is natural and fine, I just don't want too much. For the water, I basically followed the same initial steps as the first piece, but this time I ensured that the colors were more saturated with paint. It still ended up splotchy, which makes me think that if I painted this piece another time, I would not mix the orange and blue color in the same layer and do it separately like I paint the sky. In hindsight, I like the softness of the clouds in the first piece better, but for the second piece, I did want to try something different. I was thinking that I could accentuate the bright edges of the clouds if I painted the sky around it darker. This idea has potential, and it did work to some degree, but this is a technique that could use more practice and attention. While I was working, I felt like the paint was uneven and there wasn't as much of a soft and even glow like I would expect from a sunset cloud. As I was working on this part, I seriously considered creating a fourth piece. I was not immediately satisfied with the clouds or how the water looked at the stage, but like the first piece, I just kept on moving. Every step is a learning opportunity. Like I just mentioned, the water section appeared splotchy, and the second layer did not really help. Now that I'm thinking about it, there could be something off with the paper I used because I know it's pretty old, but all in all, I knew that the third layer of details would make a big difference, as you saw in the first half. I began painting the sand at the bottom with a layer of orangish paint to imitate the color of the sun shining on it. In the first piece, this area was a purplish brown color, and I think this was a great improvement. For the rest of the process, I mostly worked on the smaller details like I painted them in the first piece with slight adjustments to values and intensity. For example, I made the paint mixture for the wave details more diluted to prevent the harsh contrast I noted before. Returning to the clouds, I added another layer of paint over the top with one of the softest brushes that I own. It is a Chinese calligraphy brush. I did a little bit of work off camera, and it is kind of hard to tell, but I softened the cloud edges more by using one of my stiffer brushes to lift the paint around the dark edges of the cloud. I also did this with the water as shown here. This dark line occurred because I added too much water to the wash and the paint was pushed towards the edge and dried there. So in this step, I scrubbed the extra paint off with a stiff brush, clear water, and a paper towel. And I did this around all the edges to soften the shapes. As a side note, and before we get too close to the end of the video, please remember that all of these critiques and opinions I'm sharing are my preferences, and I believe there is always value in the unique choices artists make for their own work. Do not give anyone the power to discourage you from creating art, including me. Amongst my finishing touches, I lightly scrubbed the paint around some of the light reflections on the waves to make them glow. I then proceeded to grab my gouache paint to include some details on the ferry boat. I did not use gouache for the first piece, so that was also different. As you will see in a moment, I realized I forgot to paint the seagulls after I removed the sheet off of the block, but I did not catch that I forgot to paint the distant mountains until after filming and scanning. I just left it as it is. I did not bother to change it. In conclusion, I am proud of how my final piece turned out. I think that the colors are much more striking, and I really learned a lot more from painting both of these pieces than if I had only painted one of them. And that's all I have for you. If you enjoyed watching, consider purchasing an art print, liking this video, or subscribing to my channel. All of my supplies and information are linked below. I also love answering questions in the comments, and thank you so much for watching.